"Go ahead, tow it," I said before the chain even tightened, and the driver paused for half a second like he'd heard something he shouldn't have. But Brenda just waved him on with that tight little smile, the kind that said she'd been waiting for this moment for weeks. The metallic clink of steel links dragging under my car, cutting through the quiet suburban afternoon, while the smell of hot rubber and sun-baked asphalt hung heavy in the air. And I just stood there on my own driveway, arms crossed, watching my car lift inch by inch like it didn't belong to me anymore, like she actually had the authority to take something off my property because she decided it didn't fit community standards. Her voice floating over the engine noise, sweet and sharp at the same time, talking about violations and regulations, and how she'd warned me, always with that tone like she was doing me a favor. Like I should be grateful she was only towing it and not finding me again. And I didn't argue, didn't raise my voice, didn't even step forward because I'd already done everything I needed to do days before she ever picked up that phone. And that's the part she didn't see, the part none of them ever see, the quiet setup before the noise starts, the paperwork filed, the calls made, the little details tucked into systems they don't even know exist because to Brenda Whitmore, HOA president for the past 4 years and self-appointed guardian of perfectly aligned mailboxes and freshly edged lawns, this was just another enforcement, another box checked, another neighbor put in line. She probably thought she was teaching me a lesson as the tow truck's hydraulics whined and my car tilted back, sunlight flashing off the windshield as it settled into place like it was already gone, like it already belonged somewhere else. And I could feel the heat rising off the pavement through the soles of my boots, hear the low rumble of the engine idling, steady and patient like it had all the time in the world. And I remember thinking how quiet everything felt around the noise, how the neighborhood seemed to hold its breath, curtains barely moving, a couple of doors cracked open just enough for people to watch without being seen, because everyone knew Brenda. Everyone knew what happened when you push back, and nobody wanted to be next. So they watched me instead, waiting for the argument, the shouting, the scene, but I gave them nothing, just stood there with that same calm expression while she talked, and the driver worked and the chain locked into place, because the truth was this wasn't the moment that mattered. Not the towing, not the violation, not even the fact that she had crossed a line she didn't understand yet. The moment that mattered had already happened earlier that week in a quiet office with fluorescent lights and a phone call that lasted less than 3 minutes. A confirmation number written down on a piece of paper that was now sitting in my kitchen drawer. Something small and boring and completely invisible to someone like her. Someone who believed power was loud and obvious and printed on HOA letterhead. And as the truck started to roll forward, pulling my car with it, I saw her relax just a little, like the job was done, like the story was over. And that's when the first crack appeared, because the driver's phone rang, sharp and sudden against the steady hum of the engine, and he glanced at the screen, frowned, and slowed the truck just enough for the tires to crunch softly over the gravel at the edge of my driveway. And I felt my own phone buzz in my pocket at the exact same time, a low vibration against my leg that I didn't rush to answer, because timing matters, because some moments are better when you let them breathe. And I could see it already in her face, that flicker of confusion as the driver answered, his tone shifting from routine to careful in less than a second. And that's when I finally reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and looked straight at her as I picked up the call, because this was the part she never planned for. The part where the system she thought she controlled started talking back. And suddenly, the tow truck wasn't just hers anymore. The driver's voice dropped low the second he answered, like someone had just flipped a switch inside his head, and I could hear it even from a few feet away over the idle of the engine, the kind of tone that does not belong in routine jobs, careful, measured, every word chosen, while my own phone buzzed again in my hand, and I let it ring one more second before lifting it to my ear, keeping my eyes locked on Brenda as her smile started to stiffen at the edges, not gone yet, but no longer as certain as it had been 30 seconds ago. And when I answered, the voice on the other end did not introduce itself twice, did not ask unnecessary questions, just confirmed my name, my vehicle identification number, and the current situation in a way that told me everything was already being tracked in real time. Every movement of that truck, every line of that work order, every digital signature attached to it. And I gave a simple yes, nothing more, because the rest was already in motion, and the driver straightened up slightly in his seat, one hand still on the wheel, the other gripping the phone a little tighter as he listened, his eyes flicking from the road, ahead to the side mirror, then back toward Brenda. And that is when the shift became visible, not loud, not dramatic, just a subtle recalibration of authority, like gravity had quietly changed direction, and he could feel it before anyone else did. And Brenda stepped forward, heels clicking sharply against the concrete, asking what was taking so long. Her voice still carrying that same polished edge, but now with a hint of impatience underneath, the kind that comes when things do not move exactly as planned, and the driver did not answer her right away, which was the first real break in her control, because people like Brenda are used to immediate responses, used to compliance, used to being acknowledged the second they speak, and instead he nodded slowly into the phone, said understood, and then something else that made his shoulders tighten just a fraction before he pulled the truck to a complete stop. The sudden quiet of the engine dropping into idle, filling the space between all of us, heavy and noticeable, and I could feel the heat from the afternoon sun pressing down on my back, the faint smell of oil and metal still hanging in the air, and when he finally spoke out loud, it was not to Brenda, it was to me, asking if I was on site and requesting verbal confirmation again. And I answered clearly, steady, watching her face as the meaning started to sink in piece by piece, like a slow crack spreading through glass, because she could hear it now too, the difference in tone, the direction of the conversation, the fact that she was no longer the center of it. And she tried to step back into control, raising her voice slightly, reminding him that she was the one who authorized the tow, that there was a violation, that paperwork had been filed, but the words landed differently this time, like they were being weighed instead of accepted, and the driver turned his head just enough to look at her directly, not confrontational, just assessing, and there was a pause that stretched a little longer than comfortable before he said he needed to verify something before proceeding, and that single sentence hit harder than anything else because it introduced doubt into a situation she believed was already resolved, and I could see in the way her posture shifted, shoulders pulling back, chin lifting slightly higher, overcompensating for control that was starting to slip, and I ended the call with a quiet confirmation, slipping the phone back into my pocket without breaking eye contact, because the next part did not require words from me. It required time and systems and the kind of quiet authority that does not announce itself. And as the driver reached for the controls again, his movements slower now, more deliberate, Brenda took another step closer, asking what exactly needed to be verified, her voice sharper this time, the polish cracking just enough to reveal the edge underneath. And he glanced at her once more before looking back at the dashboard. And in that moment, before anything else happened, before the truck moved or the chain loosened or the next call came through, you could feel it, the entire situation tilting away from her, just slightly, just enough to know that whatever she thought she had started here was no longer under her control. The driver's hand hovered over the control lever for a second longer than before, like he was waiting for something invisible to catch up, and then his phone buzzed again, sharper this time, more urgent, and he did not hesitate as he picked it up, turning slightly away from Brenda, as if creating distance without stepping back, and I could hear the shift in his voice even clearer now. Respectful, precise, the kind of tone people use when they realize they are no longer dealing with a routine request, but a flag situation that carries consequences, and Brenda noticed it too, her eyes narrowing, just a fraction as she crossed her arms, trying to pull control back into her space, asking again what the delay was, her voice louder now, echoing slightly off the nearby houses, but it landed flat because the conversation she thought she owned was no longer hers to steer, and the driver nodded into the phone, listening, then glanced at the rearview mirror where my car sat lifted and secured, and I saw it in his expression. That moment when the details click together and the picture changes, when something that looked simple suddenly becomes complicated in a way that makes you careful. And he cleared his throat before speaking, not to Brenda, but into the phone, confirming that the vehicle had been hooked but not yet transported off the property, emphasizing that part like it mattered, like the line had not been fully crossed yet. And the response he got must have confirmed it, because his shoulders eased just slightly, but his movements slowed even more, deliberate now, controlled. Like every action was being observed, recorded, accounted for, and Brenda took a step closer again, her heels clicking faster this time, impatience bleeding into frustration as she demanded an explanation, mentioning HOA authority, violation notices, community rules, stacking words on top of each other like volume could replace certainty. But the driver finally turned toward her fully, not aggressive, just firm in a way that did not invite interruption. And he said he needed to verify authorization against the registered account before proceeding, each word measured. And that single sentence hit harder than anything she had said so far, because it introduced a system she did not control, a process that did not answer to her title or her tone. And I could see the moment it landed, the slight pause in her breathing, the way her jaw tightened just enough to show that she was recalculating, trying to understand where the gap was, where things had slipped, and I stayed exactly where I was, feeling the heat rise off the driveway, the faint hum of the truck engine steady beneath everything, my hands relaxed at my sides. Because this was the part where silence did more than any argument ever could, and the driver listened again, nodding once, then twice before saying understood and ending the call, his eyes flicking toward me briefly, not questioning anymore, just confirming presence. And then he reached for the controls, but this time not to move forward, not to pull away. Instead, his hand hovered over the release mechanism, and that small shift was enough for Brenda to see it, enough for the reality of the situation to start pressing in from all sides, because up until that second, everything had been moving in one direction, her direction, and now it was not. Now it was paused, balanced on a point she did not recognize, and she stepped forward again, faster this time, asking what he was doing, her voice sharper, losing that polished edge completely. And he did not answer right away, just looked at the chain, then at the vehicle, then back at her. And there was a quiet in that moment that felt heavier than the engine noise, heavier than the heat, like the entire situation was holding its breath. And I could feel it too, that exact second where everything turns, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a certainty that cannot be reversed, because whatever she thought she had set in motion, whatever authority she believed she was exercising, it was now being evaluated by something bigger than her, something she had triggered without understanding. And as the driver finally placed his hand on the release, not pulling it yet, just resting there, ready, you could see it in her eyes, that first real flash of doubt, sharp and unmistakable. Because for the first time since this started, she was no longer sure how it was going to end. The metal creaked, softly as the tension held, not tightening, not releasing, just suspended in that thin space between decision and consequence, and the driver's hand stayed on the lever without moving, like he was waiting for one last confirmation that would settle everything, while Brenda's voice cut through the air again, sharper now, losing that rehearsed calm completely, as she demanded to know why the car was not already halfway down the street. Her words coming faster, stacking over each other. HOA. Authority, violation enforcement, towing authorization. Each phrase sounding less convincing than the last, because the driver did not react the way she expected. He did not nod, did not rush, did not comply. He just looked at her for a second longer than comfortable, then shifted his attention back to the truck controls. And that silence said more than any argument ever could, because silence from someone who is supposed to follow orders is not hesitation. It is resistance, and she felt it. I could see it in the way her posture tightened, shoulders pulling up, chin lifting just a little too high, like she was trying to hold on to something that was already slipping, and the engine idled steadily beneath everything, a low mechanical hum that filled the gap where certainty used to be. And then the driver spoke again, calm, even not loud, but clear enough that every word landed exactly where it needed to, saying that the account associated with this vehicle required direct authorization verification before removal could proceed. And that phrase alone shifted the entire balance, because it introduced a rule she did not write, a system she could not override. And for a second, just a second, she hesitated, and that was all it took, that tiny pause where confidence breaks and doubt gets in. Because once doubt is there, it spreads quietly, quickly, like a crack in glass you cannot unsee. And she tried to push through it, raising her voice again, insisting that she was the one who filed the request, that the paperwork was valid, that the violation had already been documented, but the driver did not argue. He did not even disagree. He simply repeated that he needed confirmation tied to the registered priority contact. And that was when it clicked for her, not fully, not all at once, but enough to shift her expression from control to calculation. Her eyes flicking toward me for the first time, not as an obstacle, but as a variable she had not accounted for. And I did not move, did not speak, just stood there with the heat pressing against my back and the faint smell of oil still hanging in the air, letting the moment unfold exactly the way it was supposed to, because this was never about stopping the tow. It was about letting it start under the wrong assumptions, letting it reach the point where the system would step in, where everything would be documented, where the line she crossed would no longer be something she could talk her way around. And the driver's phone buzzed again, softer this time, but just as decisive, and he answered without hesitation, his tone shifting once more into that careful, precise register that comes from understanding the weight of a situation. And he listened, nodding slowly, then glanced at me again, and this time there was no question in it, just confirmation like a final piece locking into place. And when he ended the call, he did not look at Brenda first. He reached for the lever, and this time he pulled it, not to secure the vehicle, but to release the tension, the chain loosening with a controlled metallic slide that echoed across the driveway. And that sound, that simple mechanical release, hit harder than anything else that had happened so far, because it was final, unmistakable, the moment where direction changes and there is no pretending it did not. And Brenda stepped forward instantly, her voice rising, asking what he was doing, why he was stopping, but the driver stepped down from the truck, calm, steady, and told her that the tow could not proceed under the current authorization, that the account associated with the vehicle had flagged the request for review, and that continuing without proper clearance would put him and the company at risk. And the words landed one by one, each one stripping away a layer of her control, each one reinforcing the same truth she was just beginning to understand, that this was no longer her situation to command. And for the first time since this started, she had nothing ready to say, no immediate response, no confident explanation, just that brief, silent moment where reality catches up and everything she thought she knew about this situation started to fall apart right in front of her. The chain slid free with a dull metallic scrape, the weight shifting back onto my suspension inch by inch until the tires kissed the concrete again, and the driver stepped back just enough to give the machine space to settle, like he was careful not to rush the moment. Because now every movement mattered, every second counted, and Brenda stood frozen for half a breath before stepping forward again, faster this time, her voice cutting sharper through the air as she demanded he reattach it. Her words no longer smooth, no longer controlled, just raw insistence wrapped in authority that was starting to sound thinner by the second. And the driver shook his head once, not aggressive, not apologetic, just final, and said he could not proceed under the current authorization because the system had flagged the vehicle as protected under a priority account. And that phrase landed hard, heavier than anything else so far, because it was not something she could argue with, not something she could override with HOA rules or neighborhood guidelines. It was something outside her reach entirely. And I could see the realization start to settle into her expression, not fully formed yet, but enough to shift her stance, her weight moving from one foot to the other, her eyes flicking between me and the truck like she was trying to find a way back into control. And I stayed exactly where I was, letting the silence stretch just long enough for the moment to breathe, the heat of the afternoon pressing down, the faint ticking sound of the truck engine cooling slightly as it idled lower. And then her attention locked onto me again, sharper now, more focused, like she was finally seeing me not as a neighbor, not as a rule breaker, but as the missing piece in a situation she did not understand. And she asked what I had done, not accusing, not confident, just searching. And I did not answer right away, because timing matters, because some truths land better when they arrive after the noise is settled. And the driver's phone buzzed again, quick and precise, and he answered immediately, stepping a half pace away from both of us as he listened, his posture straightening slightly, his tone shifting again into that careful register that meant instructions were being given, not suggestions. And when he spoke, it was quiet, confirming details, repeating identifiers, acknowledging receipt. And then he ended the call and turned back toward us, but this time his attention went to Brenda first, not me. And that shift alone changed everything, because now she was the one being addressed, not the one giving direction, and he explained calmly that initiating a tow on a flag vehicle without direct authorization from the register account holder could trigger a compliance review, and that the company had already logged the request under her name. And I watched the exact second it hit her, the way her eyes widened just slightly, the way her lips parted like she was about to speak, but no words came out, because she understood enough now to know this was not just a stop tow. This was a record, a report, something documented beyond her control. And the driver continued, still calm, still steady, saying that any further action would require verification through proper channels, and that proceeding without it could expose both the operator and the requesting party to penalties. And that word hung there for a second. Penalties, heavier than everything else, because it was no longer about me or my car or her authority. It was about consequences, real ones, tied to systems she did not manage. And she stepped back slightly without realizing it, just enough to create distance from the truck, from the situation, from the point where everything had shifted. And I finally spoke, not loud, not confrontational, just clear enough to carry across the space between us, telling her that I had warned her earlier in the week that this was not something she wanted to escalate, that there were systems in place she did not fully understand, and she looked at me then, really looked like she was trying to replay every conversation, every notice, every moment leading up to this, searching for the point where she could have stopped, and the silence that followed was different now, no longer tense, no longer waiting, but settled, like the outcome had already been decided and we were just catching up to it. And the driver moved back toward the truck, not to reconnect anything, not to continue the tow, but to finish the process of disengaging, securing his equipment, closing out a job that had changed direction midstream. And as the last hook came free and the chain coiled back into place, the reality of it settled fully into the space around us, because she had not just lost control of the situation, she had triggered something she could not undo, and the part she still did not understand yet, the part that had not fully surfaced, was that the call that stopped this tow was only the beginning of what was about to come next. The last coil of chain clicked back into place with a hollow metallic sound that echoed longer than it should have, like the driveway itself was holding on to the moment, and the driver moved with quiet efficiency now, closing compartments, checking his panel. His entire posture shifted from action to documentation, because that is what this had become, not a tow, not an enforcement, but a recorded incident that would exist long after the truck left. And Brenda stood there watching it happen. Her arms no longer crossed, her hands hanging at her sides like she had forgotten what to do with them, her eyes tracking every movement as if she could still find a way to reverse it, and the air felt different now, heavier, like the heat had thickened, pressing against everything. And for a few seconds nobody spoke. Not me, not her, not the driver. Just the soft ticking of cooling metal and the distant hum of a lawnmower somewhere down the block. Ordinary sounds that felt out of place in a moment that was anything but ordinary. And then she broke the silence, her voice lower this time, not sharp, not loud, but strained, asking what exactly a priority account meant. And the driver paused before answering, not because he did not know, but because he was choosing how much to say. And he explained carefully that certain vehicles were registered under accounts that required direct owner authorization before any tow could be completed, especially when the request originated from a third party, and that any attempt to bypass that process triggered an automatic review within their system. And I watched her process that piece by piece. The way her expression shifted from confusion to something closer to concern, because now it was no longer about whether the tow would happen. It was about what had already been set in motion, and she asked who authorized that kind of status, who put it in place, and that question hung there for a second before I answered, calm, steady, telling her that it was not something you applied for at the last minute, not something you added after a problem started. It was something tied to long-term accounts, to contracts, to systems that operate quietly in the background until someone forces them to respond. And I could see it then, the exact second she realized this had been set up before today, before the tow, before her decision, that she had walked straight into a situation that was already prepared for her. And the driver's phone buzzed again, shorter this time, and he glanced at it, nodded once, and then looked at Brenda directly. explaining that the request had now been escalated for compliance review and that her information was attached to the initial authorization attempt, and the word attached seemed to land harder than anything else because it meant permanence, it meant traceability, it meant this was not going away when the truck drove off and she stepped back another inch, barely noticeable, but enough to show that the ground under her confidence was no longer solid, and she tried to recover, mentioning HOA bylaws, enforcement rights, community authority, but the words sounded rehearsed now, disconnected from the reality, unfolding in front of her because none of those things applied here, none of them reached into the system that had just shut her down, and the driver did not argue, he did not challenge her, he simply said that his company followed state regulations and contractual obligations first, and that any dispute beyond that would need to be handled through proper channels. And that phrase again, proper channels, closed the door on everything she was trying to assert. And I shifted my weight slightly, feeling the rough texture of the concrete under my boots, the heat still rising in waves. And I told her quietly that this was why I had asked her to step back earlier in the week, why I told her not to escalate something she did not fully understand, because once it reached this point, it was no longer a conversation between neighbors. It was a process, and processes do not care about tone or titles or who thinks they are in charge. They follow rules. And those rules were now moving forward without her input. And the driver climbed back into the truck, not hurried, not slow, just done, and the engine revved slightly as he prepared to leave, the sound cutting through the heavy air like a final punctuation mark. And Brenda stood there, still, watching him, watching the truck, watching the situation slip further out of her reach with every passing second. And as the vehicle pulled away from the curb, leaving my car exactly where it had started, untouched, grounded, the reality settled fully into place because she had not just failed to take something from me. She had triggered something that was now moving in the opposite direction, and the part she still did not see yet, the part that was already unfolding beyond this driveway, was that the system she had activated was not finished with her. The sound of the tow truck faded down the street, leaving behind a strange kind of quiet that felt heavier than the noise ever did, like the moment after something irreversible has already happened but is not fully settled yet. And Brenda stood there on the edge of my driveway, not moving, not speaking, just watching the empty space where she expected my car to be gone. Her eyes fixed on nothing, like she was trying to rewind the last 10 minutes in her head and find the exact second it all slipped out of her control. And I could almost see it, the mental replay, the call she made, the signature she gave, the confidence she carried into this, thinking it would be just another enforcement, just another neighbor falling in line. And now that certainty was gone, replaced by something quieter, something sharper, the beginning of understanding, and the air still carried that faint mix of engine heat and sun-baked concrete. But it felt different now, like the tension had shifted directions, no longer pressing on me, but settling squarely on her. And she finally turned toward me again, slower this time, like she was choosing her next words carefully, asking what exactly was going to happen next. And there was no accusation in it now, no edge, just a question that sounded smaller than anything she had said before. And I took a breath, feeling the heat in my chest, the steady rhythm of everything finally lining up the way it was supposed to, and I told her the truth, simple and direct, that once a request like that gets flagged, it does not just disappear, it gets reviewed, logged, traced, every detail checked against regulations and contracts. And the part most people do not realize is that it is not about the tow anymore. It is about the attempt, the authorization, the justification behind it. And I could see her absorb that slowly, the weight of it settling into her posture, the way her shoulders dropped just slightly, like she was starting to understand that this was not something she could fix with a phone call or a meeting or a vote. And she asked if she could cancel it, if she could call them back and clear it up. And I shook my head once, not harsh, just honest, explaining that it does not work like that. Not once it has been escalated, because now it is part of a system that does not forget. And the quiet between us stretched again, longer this time, filled with the distant sounds of normal life continuing around us, a car driving by at the end of the street, someone closing a garage door, things that had nothing to do with what just happened but somehow made it feel even more real. And she looked down at the ground for a second, then back up, her expression tighter now, more controlled, but not in the same way as before. This was not control over the situation. This was control over herself, trying to hold everything together as the realization settled in. And I could tell she was already thinking ahead, already trying to figure out how this would look, who would be involved, what questions she would have to answer. Because people like Brenda do not just react to the moment. They react to the fallout, to the perception, to the consequences that come after. And I stepped back slightly, giving her space, not because I needed it, but because the situation had shifted completely. It was no longer about confrontation. It was about aftermath. And I told her quietly that this was exactly why I kept everything documented, every notice, every conversation, every warning I gave her before today, because when things reach this point, it is not about who is louder or who thinks they are right. It is about what can be proven, what has been recorded, what stands when everything is reviewed. And she nodded once, almost automatically, like she understood that part at least, like she knew documentation was something she had relied on herself until it turned against her, and the silence settled again. But this time it was different, calmer, heavier, final in a way that did not need to be explained. And as she turned to walk back toward the street, her steps slower than before, the confidence gone from the way her heels hit the pavement. I knew this was not the end of it. Not even close, because the real consequences were not happening here on this driveway. They were already in motion somewhere else, in offices and systems, in reports that were being reviewed by people who did not care about HOA authority or neighborhood rules, only about whether the process had been followed or broken. And the part she still had not fully grasped yet was that she had not just lost control of this moment. She had created a record that was about to follow her into every conversation that came next. The rest of that day moved slower than it should have, like time itself was dragging its feet through the aftermath, and I could feel it in the way the air hung still over the driveway, in the way every small sound seemed louder than usual. A distant car door shutting, a dog barking 2 houses down, normal things that suddenly felt like background noise to something much bigger that had already started unfolding out of sight. And Brenda did not come back that afternoon. Not to argue, not to explain, not to try and reassert anything. She just disappeared behind the quiet walls of her house like she needed space to think, to calculate, to understand what she had stepped into. And I went inside for a while, letting the cool air settle against my skin. But even there I could not ignore it, the low vibration of something still moving, because this was never just about the driveway, never just about the tow. It was about the system she had triggered. And those systems do not stop just because the visible part ends. They keep going quietly, methodically, checking, verifying, documenting. And by the time the sun started dropping lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the street, my phone buzzed again, not loud, not urgent, just a steady reminder that the process had moved to the next stage. And when I answered, the voice on the other end was different this time, more formal, more structured, asking for confirmation of the earlier incident, verifying location, time, and the initial request details. And I gave them exactly what they needed, nothing more, nothing less, because this was no longer about telling a story. It was about confirming facts, and facts are what carry weight when everything gets reviewed. And as I stood there near the window, looking out at the same stretch of pavement where it all started, I could see Brenda's front door open across the street, slow, careful, like she was stepping into something uncertain, and she walked out with her phone already in her hand, her posture tighter than before, her movements sharper, like she was already mid-conversation, already trying to get ahead of something she could feel closing in. And I watched her pace along the edge of her lawn, back and forth, her free hand moving in small, controlled gestures that spoke louder than her voice, because even without hearing her, you could tell this was not a confident call. This was not someone giving instructions. This was someone asking questions, someone trying to understand why something had not gone the way it was supposed to, and I could almost map it out in real time. The explanation she was getting, the same words the driver had used: flagged account, authorization mismatch, compliance review, terms that sound technical until you realize they come with consequences attached. And she stopped pacing for a second, just stood there, her head tilted slightly as she listened. And that stillness said more than anything else, because that is what happens when the full picture finally lands, when all the small pieces come together into something you cannot ignore anymore. And when she started moving again, It was slower, more deliberate, like she was no longer trying to control the situation, but trying to contain it. And I stepped back from the window, letting the scene settle without me watching every second, because I already knew how this part plays out. I had seen it before, not with her, not in this exact way, but enough times to recognize the pattern. The moment when someone realizes they're no longer ahead of the problem, they're inside it, and everything they do next is reactive instead of proactive. And later that evening, as the sky dimmed and the streetlights flicker on one by one, there was another call, shorter this time, more direct, confirming that the review had officially been opened, that all associated details had been logged, and that any further inquiry would involve both the requesting party and the property owner. And I thanked them, simple, calm, and ended the call because that was all that needed to be said. And as I stepped back outside, the night air cooler now, carrying none of the heat from earlier, the street felt quieter, but not peaceful. More like it was waiting, like something was about to surface, and across the street, Brenda's house sat with its lights on, every room glowing a little too bright, like she was not ready for the dark just yet, like she was still trying to keep control over something that had already moved beyond her reach. And the truth was, this was only the part she could see, the visible shift, the immediate reaction, the beginning of consequences, but what she still did not understand, what she had not fully grasped yet, was that the real impact of what she did was not going to show up in a single moment or a single conversation. It was an unfold step by step, documented, reviewed, and carried forward into every decision that came next. And by the time she realized exactly how far it reached, it would already be too late to stop it. The next morning did not come with noise or confrontation. It came with something quieter, something far more controlled, the kind of silence that carries weight because you know something is already in motion, and I felt it before I even stepped outside, that low, steady sense that the process had moved forward overnight, that somewhere between the last light of yesterday and the first light of today, decisions have been made, boxes have been checked, records have been reviewed, and when I opened my front door, the air was cooler, cleaner, but the street felt different, like it was holding on to something just beneath the surface, and my car sat exactly where it had been left, untouched, grounded, almost like a marker of everything that had happened. And across the street, Brenda's house looked the same at a glance, but not when you really looked at it, not when you noticed the blinds slightly tilted, the front door opening just a little too quickly when she stepped out, her movements sharper, more deliberate, like someone who had not slept well, like someone who had spent the night trying to get ahead of something that kept moving anyway. And she saw me almost immediately, her eyes locking onto mine for a second before she looked away, not out of confidence this time, but calculation, like she was deciding how to approach something she no longer fully understood, and she walked toward the edge of her driveway, slower than before, her steps measured, controlled, but the confidence was not there anymore. Not the kind she carried yesterday. This was something else, something quieter, more cautious. And when she finally spoke, her voice was lower, more contained, asking if I had heard anything back. And I could tell by the way she phrased it that she already had, that she was not asking for information. She was asking for confirmation. And I nodded once, keeping it simple, telling her that the review had been opened and that everything from yesterday had been logged and attached to it. And the word attached landed again. I saw in the way her jaw tightened, the way her shoulders shifted just slightly, because that was the part she could not undo. The permanence of it, the fact that this was no longer just a moment, it was a record, and she took a breath, slow, controlled, and said that she had spoken to someone late last night, someone from the company, and that they had mentioned escalation, compliance, possible follow-up, words that sounded technical, but carried a very real edge now. And she asked what it meant for her, not demanding, not asserting, just asking. And I let the silence sit for a second before answering, because this was the part where the truth matters more than anything else. And I told her that it meant the system would do exactly what it was designed to do. It would review the request, verify the authorization, check whether the process had been followed correctly, and if it had not, it would move forward accordingly. And she nodded slowly, like she already knew that, like she had been told the same thing, but needed to hear it again in plain terms. And for a second we just stood there, the morning light stretching across the pavement, the quiet of the neighborhood settling around us. And then she asked the question she had been holding back, the one that mattered more than the rest, asking how I knew this would happen. And I looked at her, really looked this time, and told her that I did not guess, I prepared, that I had seen situations like this before, where someone assumes authority extends further than it actually does, where they push into systems they do not fully understand, and that I had made sure everything on my end was documented, registered, protected long before she made that call. And the realization settled fully into her expression then, not sudden, not dramatic, just complete, the understanding that this was never a reaction. It was set up, a quiet one, built in advance, waiting for the exact moment she decided to cross that line. And she let out a slow breath, not frustrated, not angry, just resigned, like